I'm unique among my 1689 Reformed Baptist friends in the sense that I actually do prescribe, and I believe that I can do this consistently from my position, but I do prescribe to covenant succession as it's literally defined, that it's the, not presumption, not assumption, but it's the eager, joyful, humble expectation of Christian parents that their children will succeed them in the faith, not by covenant nature, but by covenant nurture. And I do believe, even as a Baptist, that by covenant nurture, not that God owes us, it's not that there's a way in which we can work the God of the universe into our debt, but what I wish more Reformed 1689 Baptists recognized is that it's not so much an argument of good, godly parenting meriting the salvation of our children, but I wish, I've said it like this, I wish that more Reformed Baptists would recognize that there's a thin but real distinction between unconditional election and arbitrary election. And God's election is not arbitrary. It is unconditional, but it is not arbitrary in the sense that God never severs means from ends. The means of grace are designated by God exclusively for bringing about his ends of grace. Romans 10:14, how will they believe unless they hear? How will they hear unless someone preaches? And so again and again and again, we see God bringing about his decretive will in its ends of grace and in every facet, but especially as it pertains to the salvation of an individual. The ends of grace in salvation are always brought about by the means of grace. And therefore, I believe that, again, it's not meriting, so it's not a 100% guarantee, which even the Presbyterian one in Affirm, they have a category for apostate children being, a part of, this external covenant members, but not internal, not decretal elect. And so even the Presbyterian has this understanding. And so on the Baptist side of the aisle, what I'm recognizing is I'm saying that by and large, more often than not, I think that it should be the hopeful but serious expectation of Christian Reformed covenantal Baptist parents that God is going to save not some and not most, but all of our children. And that's precisely why he gave those children to us. If God was not intent on my children being elect and saving them, he could have given them to my pagan neighbor. But he gave them to me because the means of grace are not severed from the ends of grace. Unconditional election is not synonymous with arbitrary election. God brings forth salvation through a designated means, and it's a means that just so happens that my wife and I are very committed by the grace of God to submerge and immerse our children in, namely gospel preaching, catechism, training up in the paideia of the Lord, in our home through family worship, in our children's education through a Christian classical school, through participation in the Lord's Day, both in the morning service and the evening service, in the means of grace, that our children are swimming in this. And so again, it's not that that if we do this, God owes us that, but it is to suspect that it is God's ordinary pattern to use his ordinary means of grace to bring about the ends of salvation. Unconditional election is not arbitrary election. And to those who would push back and say, well, what about, Jesus who says, I have not come to bring peace, but a sword, division. From now on, a household of 5 will have 2 against 3 and 3 against 2. I personally, and I'd like to get your sense on this, Joe, if you agree, I personally see that as Jesus speaking it's not an indefinite prophetic declaration, or but a not a prescription, indefinite prescription, but a particular temporary description of what it looks like in the days of Christ in his earthly ministry for the gospel to come to a first generation. That was ultimately predominantly hardened in unbelief, that ultimately crucified the Messiah, rejected. He came to his own, but they received him not. And so when the gospel first comes to bear with the first generation, that's what we saw in the time of Christ. And I would say that that's a pattern that we continue to see throughout this gospel age whenever the gospel comes for the first time to a first generation. So whether it be Judaism at the time of Christ, or whether it be an Islamic nation, or whether it be some other pagan nation, when the gospel first comes to bear, we do see it being ordinary, the splitting of households, that a husband is saved and a wife is not, that a sibling is saved and another is not, that the children are saved but the parents are not, or vice versa. But on the heels of multiple generations of Christendom, that should no longer be the pattern. I think that you should expect in countries and cultures that have been dominated by a Christian ethic, Christian gospel, Christian preaching, Christian culture for centuries, we should expect that by faithful parenting, covenant nurture, we should have covenant succession, an expectation that God would save not just some or most, but all of our children. And I think the Baptist, the covenantal Reformed 1689 Baptist, has just as much claim on that doctrine of covenant succession as the Presbyterian. Tell me I'm crazy. What do you think?
I like that. I think this is I'm encouraged that we're singing from the same hymn sheet on this, and I do think it's an indication that actually we're in a time when faithful Reformed people can get closer and closer together on the significance of the covenant. I mentioned that I had served in both Baptistic and Paedo-Baptist churches. When I planted Westminster Chapel in Toronto, about it was 2008, so 14, 15 years ago now, I had initially had conversations with the Anglicans, because that's where in London, in England, that had been where I had been more familiar with pastoral ministry. But I very quickly discovered that was going to be essentially impossible because of the state of the Episcopal Church in North America. It was at a time when it was all beginning to move in a strongly liberal direction and fall apart. So that never happened. So the plant ended up being a bit of a coalition of the willing, and it was a Baptist movement that wanted to come alongside this vision that I put together a plant team, and we had this vision for the church plant. It's actually a conservative evangelical Baptistic movement that said, we would love to stand with you in this. And so I thought, well, who is the Lord brought alongside us right now? And I had some interesting conversations early on, because this particular movement that I won't name on the podcast, but this particular movement, it's sort of confession of faith. It's peculiar commitments opened with this statement: the Church of Jesus Christ consists of all fully immersed believers. It was a holdover from a very, very sort of strongly Baptists in Canada seeking to find their peculiar identity in the practice of water baptism by full immersion. And I said to them, I said, look, I want to work with you. This is I think a God ordained coalition of the willing. But I said I cannot sign up to that. I can't possibly sign up to that statement of faith. I can't agree with that. How can we say that George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards and John Wesley and William Wilberforce and many of the Puritans and Charles Hodge and Benjamin Warfield, these people are not part of the Church of Jesus Christ because they're not fully immersed? Of course, the absurdity of the position was very obvious to them as we talked about it at the table. And they said, well, no, you can just ignore that. And I said, I want to be able to receive people who have been baptized as infants. I said, this is a church plant in a pagan, one of the most pagan cosmopolitan cities in North America, perhaps the most multicultural in the world. I said, this is not a time for us to be all saying we all want to pee in our own paddling pools. I said, this needs to be, I need to be able to receive people who were baptized in evangelical Reformed homes as infants, who believe that their baptism is valid and they stand by that baptism and they want to become members or want to move into show promise to move into leadership positions, I want to be able to receive them. And, I was given dispensation to do that. Periodically, I was accused of dry baptisms of infants, because when we dedicated children, I would use a bottle of oil and make the sign of the cross on their forehead. Quite an Anglican thing to do. And there was this a dry baptism. No, I was careful with the wording. It was that covenant succession. That's the kind of wording that I used. In the ideal world, this wasn't possible in that context, because we were part of a large family of Baptist churches, and I wanted to respect and honor the fact that the practice of baptism in the life of the church needed to be in keeping with the fellowship we were part of. That is the God honoring thing to do. In my ideal world, I would have gone with an approach, because we had elders in the church that were both Pado Baptist and Credo Baptist, and lived together in joy and harmony in the leadership of the church. I would have ideally liked to have gone with the conscience of the parents. That I would have gone with what is it that the parents believed, that because we had people from the church of about 400 in the end, by the time that I moved on, and we had people from a variety of different backgrounds in different places. Some people wanted to reaffirm their baptismal vows of their parents by full immersion. So it wasn't a rebaptism as such, it was a reaffirmation. This is something that some of the Reformed Anglican churches do in England. If somebody feels they were christened by unbelieving parents, by an unbelieving pastor or vicar, they want to reaffirm something. So there are a number of things that could be done there, and there were some people that wanted to do that, but there were others that had the conviction that no, they're Presbyterian or Anglican faithful parents. It was a legitimate baptism. And so in the ideal world for me, at this cultural moment, and at this time in which we're living, especially in these sort of missional environments in inner city metropolitan centers, where we need to be bringing God's people together around the truth of the covenant, his law, the lordship of Christ, the fullness of the gospel, the Reformed faith. I think that to me, and I know I probably will upset people on both sides of the aisle saying that, but that's really what ideally I would have wanted to do is affirm the conscience, the conviction of the family, the parents, and gone with the mode of baptism that they were requesting.